The relationship between Isaac and his son Esav is very complex and very difficult to understand. And there's a very deep lesson there in how to deal with children who maybe don't necessarily follow in a parent's footstep. And it's about acceptance, and it's about seeing deep in what you know it seems to be the obvious, and really kind of digging below the surface to appreciate. The parasha begins by telling us about the mutual relationship of Yitzchak, Esav, and then Rivka and Yaakov. The word favored, I'm not sure is the best English translation. Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav means Yitzchak loved Esav, and it gives us a reason. The Rivka habited Yaakov, and Rivka loved Yaakov. So traditional kind of shut interpretation of this verse. Rivka loves Yaakov, no explanation needed. The actual in the English you can't really see it, but Ohevet is kind of she was loving. It was an ongoing, natural feeling for the son that obviously was, giving them both a lot of nachas. On the other hand, Yitzchak says, "Vayehav," he loved him. That he was loving him, which implied that he kind of had to make himself love him. But the reason we're told is tzayid befiv. So that's game, tzayid, befiv in his mouth. So pshat, at the superficial level, Rashi says that the literal meaning of this is that there was always a game, there was hunting in the mouth of Isaac, because Esav used to go out there. He was a good hunter, and he used to come back with food and serve his father. And this is how Yitzchak, and this would be the literal meaning of these words, Tzad the fifth. This is how, Esav managed to find favor with his father. The second interpretation, because that would be very, very shallow, where, preferences here on account of, he's being bribed with food. So then Rashi, still at the pshat level, but less literal, says, no, tzad b'fiv doesn't mean there was hunting in the mouth of Yitzchak, in that he was being fed, but tzad b'fiv, there was hunting in the mouth of Esav. In other words, he hunted, he trapped his father into thinking he was better than he really was. And he used to misrepresent himself and come across as somebody very righteous, very pious. He would come to his father and pose all kinds of questions, halakhic questions, dilemmas. The example given is, how do you give tithes from salt, which is incidentally not a food and therefore not not obligated in tithes. So that was how Esav went about hunting, trapping Yitzchak. Even that's kind of somewhat difficult to understand, because we're dealing here with a certain naivete on Yitzchak's part, that he was so easily fooled. And people explain that he was blind, physically blind, and because of that, he couldn't really see the full picture of what was going on. We're going to come back to that blindness a little while, but let's actually start the story from its very, very end. So the end of the story is when Yaakov passes on. At that point, the children of Israel, Yaakov and his sons, have all gone to Egypt. They've been there for 17 years, and Yaakov passes on. It's the last portion of the book of Bereshit, and Yaakov makes his sons swear that he's not going to be buried in Egypt. He's going to be taken to Sdei Machpelah, to the field of Machpelah. It's the field that we were talking about in Ashir last week. That was what Abraham bought from Ephron, the burial site. That's Mata Machpelah, this famous tomb of the patriarchs. Well, that's the building, Herodian style, Herodian period building that's been built over it. And although the memorials for each of the Avot, matriarchs, patriarchs are somewhere inside that structure there to the left. But it is believed that the actual tombs are somewhere here, in this area here, if you can see the arrow. But that's it looks very simple, but in fact, it was more complicated than that. In that, it didn't go that easy. It didn't go that easy. What actually happened is that there was objections raised by Esav. When Esav found out that Yaakov was taking his place in the um, um, tomb of the patriarchs, he was upset. He said, "Wait a second, no, our father had two sons, and therefore there are two burial places left." Yaakov lost his wife Leah at some stage, and she was buried there. We know that because he tells his children that I have buried Leah, and I want her buried alongside. No, we're not going to. I'm not going to allow. Now, Yaakov, when talking to his children, had said, "I have purchased this burial plot from Ephron," because he didn't buy it. It was Abraham, his grandfather, who had bought it from Ephron. So what has Yaakov said? I bought this. He actually bought his rights away from Esav. When they made that deal where there was the birthright and all that, at the time that there was that sale, there was a contract drawn up, and part of this agreement was that Yaakov was entitled to the burial plot, and Esav get other benefits in exchange for that. So the Targum Yonatan records the story, and Esav says, "Okay, fine, but you got to, bring proof." So Naphtali, who is compared to a gazelle, that's because he was a very swift runner, goes back to Egypt while Jacob's funeral was being delayed. And he runs down to Mitzrayim to bring back this deed of sale, where Esav had clearly said to Yaakov, "You have a right to both of these plots." In the meantime, there's a man called Chusham. Chusham is the son of Dan, and he happened to be deaf. So he didn't understand what was going on. He just saw Esav being, objecting to the burial of his grandfather. He was outraged that his grandfather's coffin was lying there waiting to be buried. He was very upset about it, and he took a sword, struck off the head of Esav, and this is the very interesting thing. The head of Esav rolls into the cave and rests upon Isaac, his father. And then the sons of Esav, they bury his body elsewhere in the field, and the sons of Yaakov bury Yaakov in that field, in the tomb that was designated for him. This is a very interesting story, that at the end of it all, Esav's head ends up being with Yitzchak. His body ends up being elsewhere. And this is actually how we're going to understand their relationship. Now, this is a very strange idea that the head of a wicked person should end up in next to a tzaddik. It's totally inappropriate, and we're always very careful that we don't bury wicked people alongside tzaddikim. And it's based on a story in the prophets, in Book of Kings. Where are we? Book of Kings is actually Book of Samuel 2, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I've written it down here on the slide. But here's a scary story. The Mishnah states that one would not bury the executed transgressors in their ancestral burial plots, but there was a special graveyard set aside for those who have been executed. And why, says the Talmud? Because a wicked man is not buried next to a righteous man. And this is derived from the story of funeral which was taking place. They were burying a man, and as the funeral was taking place, there was a raiding party, robbers. So they were terrified, and there was Elisha's tomb. So they threw the man into Elisha's tomb, and as the man came there, he came in contact with Elisha, Kings 2, I'm sorry, 2, Kings, not Samuel. He revived, came to life, stood up on his feet. So the man wasn't righteous, and he was resurrected miraculously, so he wouldn't remain buried alongside Elisha. This is a kind of source for the concept that the wicked are not buried alongside the righteous. So how does it happen that Esav is buried next to his father, Yitzchak, or at least his head is buried there? And the answer is this: Esav's head is holy, and when severed from his body, it belongs with Yitzchak. Esav, when connected to a body, is the impersonation of wickedness. And Yitzchak was able to make that distinction. Yitzchak was able to see in his son not the body, that which dragged him into the mud, that which turned him into an idolater, into a murderer, into, in fact, as the Medrash tells us, a rapist and a robber. He was actually able to see that deep inside Yitzchak, there's something that has to be redeemed. And that's the head. If you kind of try to separate the head from the body, you get to the essence of who Esav is now. Who is Yaakov? Sorry, who is Yitzchak? And what do we read is the occupation that takes up quite a big part of this week's portion. A whale digger. It tells us about this well and that well, and he dug this one and that one, and there were fights with the Philistines. What do you do when you dig a well? So in this country, we very big on digging boreholes, because we're not always comfortable that the municipalities can provide us with the utilities we need. So people go out and what does the diviner who finds you the place where it's best to drill? They come with their sticks and they're looking for a hidden resource. And you dig a well to find a resource which is deep inside the ground. That's Yitzchak. He's a well digger, meaning that he looks deep inside and finds a hidden resource. And this is what he was doing. Oh, hello, young man. This is what he was doing with Esav. He could see deep inside of Esav, and he could find the redeeming features. So we said Esav tricked his father, but Yitzchak could see deeply in. And we attribute Yitzchak's naivete to his blindness, but blind people actually develop other senses. And so, although Yitzchak couldn't see Esav who he was in a physical way, but other senses become more acute because people compensate for their lack of being able to see by having, more, a stronger sense of smell, a stronger sense of hearing, and so forth, recognizing voices, and they compensate. So Yaakov developed another kind of sense that allowed him to perceive. Yes, so his blindness was a reason for loving his son, for loving Esav, because he developed an ability to be attuned to the soul of Esav and to the depth of what is lying within Esav. And when we say there was tzayid befil, there was something captured, venison. We were talking about hunting that he had captured in his mouth. It meant that Esav had sparks of holiness that were trapped within him. And his father realized that, and his father was able to tap into that, and he hoped to uncover that and bring out the essence. So although the love for Yaakov was obviously natural, and that's all Rivka could do. She couldn't see beyond the depth of Esav. Yitzchak could see it within himself, not just not to reject the son, but actually to love him, and to look for the redeeming features in him. So if we look at the famous passage, which is in the Parsha, where Yitzchak is doing something strange, he's asking Esav to come with venison, as he was good, able to do very well, and he would bless him. He said, "I'll bless you before I die, Yaakov." So Yitzchak thought the end of his time had come. He lived a little bit longer still, but he thought it was the end. And he said, we don't find that Abraham blessed Yitzchak. We don't find anywhere in earlier history there was a formal process of blessing before moving on. Yaakov will do the same. He'll bless his children, so he learned from his father. But it's something novel. What he's actually trying to do is bring out something in Esav, and he wasn't allowed to do that. I mean, fate had it otherwise, and his wife's interference had it otherwise. But the reality is, this is what he was trying to achieve. So let's look at a selection of that famous passage where he discusses with his son that he'd he's going to bless him. And this is when, as I said, there's Tzad the fifth, there's all that unbelievable hidden resource in Esav. So Yaakov, disguised as Esav, arrives, and he brings the food that he has prepared. And his father says to him, "Who are you, my son? Mi ata b'ni." The intention maybe is, which of my sons are you? But he uses the word b'ni. And Yaakov says, "No, I'm Esav, your firstborn. I did what you told him, etc." And Yaakov, so Yitzchak continues. He says, "Maze mi'ata limtzo b'ni." How do you succeed so quickly, my son? And then he says again, "Kshana ushcha b'ni, please come. I want to feel you, my son. Are you b'ni? Are you my son, Esav, or not?" And then he says it again. "Are you my son, Esav?" He said, "I am." And finally he says, "Okay, come near, and I will eat from my son's venison, from my son's game." And there seems to be a repetition of one word, and I've overemphasized it, and you must have worked it out. Here's the text. Oh, there we go, one more time. I left that one out. Come over here, and I will kiss you, my son. And then he says, see, behold, the scent of Beni, my son, is like the field that God has blessed. So let's count them. We got them here. I just put the Hebrew text, and we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 instances of that word Beni. That's the passage we just read in English and in Hebrew. 7 times he's saying Beni, my son. Now, what is this theme of the repetition of Beni? So those familiar with the Bible will, and this is a text that's going to be in that's what Samuel too. They're going to be familiar with the story of a passage where that word beni is found over and over and over. And the story is that of David and Avshalom. And Avshalom, of course, he led a rebellion against his father. It was a coup. He chased him out of the palace, and King David was a refugee. He'd lost his kingdom, and of course, it resulted in somewhat of a civil war because Avshalom had his followers, and King David had to pursue him, and it was, let's put it, hectic. And here's another example of a father-son relationship. It's not just that Avshalom isn't like Esav following in his father's footsteps and he's sinning and he's a bad boy. He's bad news. Avshalom actually wants to kill his own father. He wants to usurp his throne, which didn't have to go his way. It was destined to go, of course, to one of the other brothers. We know Solomon, but Avshalom is determined to rule in his father's lifetime. And of course, there's this tragedy where tragedy saved King David and his kingdom, but he's caught in his hair, in some bushes, and is left hanging there with his animal that he was riding, moving on. And then the armies of King David throw spears through his body, and he perishes there. And the text I was just showing you is King David's reaction. Let's go back there. What does he say to? So the king was very upset when he heard about the death of his son, and he cried, and he says, "Beni, Beni, 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 Beni." That's how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My son Avshalom, my son Avshalom. If only I died instead of you, my son, my son. And then a few verses later, it says the king covers his face and he kept on crying aloud, "My son, my son, my son." So he's doing one better than Yitzchak, because he's actually using the word beni in about 5 verses. There's a bit of a space in between. I think there are 2 or 3 verses in between this one and that one. He's saying, "My son, my son, my son." So the Talmud queries this, and this is where I bring in the story, because we can shed some light on the life of Yitzchak and his using of that term beni, by looking at the comment on this. The Talmud says, what was King David doing by repeating this beni, beni, beni? And remember, this is the boy who wanted to kill him, who wanted to overthrow his kingship and become the ruler. So the Gemara says, what King David wanted to do was to raise him up from the 7 chambers of Gehenna, and then the 8th time he wanted to bring Avshalom to the world to come. So we get an idea that a father using that word beni, my son, is actually a way of kind of elevating him. And in the case of King David and his son Avshalom, Avshalom was wicked, he was now dead, and for sure, after the way he had behaved, he would end up not just in Gehenna, but he would end up, on the bottom floor. And King David is working very hard by showing his love for him, to get him some protectia, to get him rid of a pass, to be able to go one floor up, another floor up, and eventually out of Gehenna altogether, and to go to a more positive place for his soul. When Yitzchak says beni, 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 we can also see that he's trying to elevate Esav to a higher place. And to understand what this is about, we need to do a bit of a numbers game and understand numerology. And we actually looked at these numbers a couple of years ago, but let's just look at it again, because that'll help us understand what's actually happening here. So here we are. We have, and we're going to look at numbers. Yitzchak, Isaac. His name is spelled Yud Tzadi Chet Kuf, which in numerical value is 10 and 90 and 8 and 100. Yud Tzadi Chet and Kuf. And that gives you a total of 208. What's significant about that number is that that's 8 times the magical number 26, which is the numerical value of God's name. Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, that would add to 26. So Yitzchak has got 8 powers of godliness. So we're going to look at a family tree in a moment. And by right, what should happen here is that because he has 2 sons, so you have to divide the inheritance, and there should be 4 times 26 for Yaakov and 4 for Esav. But that's not what happens. Yaakov, let's look at the numerical value of his name, is 182. 2 plus 100 plus 70 plus 10, that's the numerical value of these 4 letters, gives 182. That is, if somebody's quick with numbers, 7 times 26. So he gets a lion's share. Esav, on the other hand, and that's 6, 370, right? 6, 370, 376. Look at that. That is the equivalent of the word tamei. Tamei is impure 7 times, because the word tamei is 149 or 50, and 7 times tamei, 7 times impure is 350. That leaves you with a balance of 26. So 7 parts of divinity, divineness go to Yaakov, 1 part goes to Esav, and he's got 7 times 300, tamei, 7 times impure. And what's Yaakov doing now? Beni, Beni, Beni. He's trying to chip away at that power of impurity that is taking over Esav's body. There is that part that is kind of in his head, the 26, and he's trying to elevate that so that the divine in Esav should be able to shine out. That's Esav. Sorry, that's Yitzchak, the blind man who can perceive with his senses something far deeper. And this is Yitzchak, who's trying to elevate Esav and separate his head from his body. Not that's physically that's going to happen at a later stage. And then there's a bit of a epilogue to the story, because of course this was not meant to be. Although Yitzchak intended to bless Esav, it didn't quite turn out that way. That's totally different discussion for another time. We are running out of time, but Shkram, he wanted to elevate the tumah, the tameh of Esav through those 7 benis. The consequences for the brother, the twin, Yaakov, were quite severe. At the end of the parasha, we find that Esav is so angry, wants to kill him, and his parents decide to send him away. And he goes off and he's in exile for a long time because he remained with Lavan for 34 years. 34? Yeah, 34 years. In addition to that, he also spent 14 years before he even got to Lavan, we're told. Because if you try and correlate the numbers, there's a missing decade and a half, 14 years that he spent in hiding in the house of study of Shem and Eva. So that's a very long time to be away. And finally, he's coming home and he's got to confront Esav. When he sends messengers ahead, and he says, "Go please and tell my brother Esav that I'm back," the messengers come back with the following message: "We went to your brother, to Esav." Now you think of him as your brother. He's not. He's Esav. He's actually got an army that's coming to kill you. So now Yaakov is going to attempt to complete the task that his father began, and that is to kind of peel off the layers and get to the essence of Esav. And here's a famous verse where the reunion takes place. That is where Yaakov finally comes face to face with Esav, and after having sent gifts and the whole family, and he's put them all in strategic formations, it says he himself went on ahead, bowed low to the ground 7 times until he reached his brother. What is he doing here? It's a 7 times bowing. He's kind of peeling the layers of Esav until he reaches what doesn't say Esav. It says Achiv. He reached his brother. Once he was able to peel off the 7 layers, then he reached his brother. He reached not Esav, but he reached a place where there's brotherhood and love. And we know that the consequence of that was that they embraced and they hugged, and they kind of reconciled, even though Yaakov remained quite suspect. So this is the beauty of a relationship that Yitzchak was able to bring out. In a son, many of us would have kicked out the house and written off and never wanted to, or as was practiced, in generations ago, sat shiva for. Yitzchak leads the way for us to embrace even wayward children. And Yitzchak leads the way for us all to be well diggers and to look beyond the surface and to find redeeming features in every person that we come across. Thank you.